Well, my name is Daniel Stephenson. I started back in 1999 as a Perl developer, as an unqualified Perl developer. Back then, demand was really high and supply was really low, and so I did enough complaining in my tech support job that they brought me on as a fixer of bugs Perl guy. And that's kind of how I started, and worked with Perl for 5 years, and then moved on to other languages, did a little PHP, and then I've done heavy Java for the last 7 or 8 years, and now I'm into Python, and a lot more front-end development than I ever thought I would do. So I helped start a boot camp down in Provo, a web development boot camp, essentially. And we started really heavy with Python, and it was more of a computer science type boot camp, and recognized that though we were teaching really good foundational skills, we were lacking maybe some of the practicality that needed to come out of that boot camp. And so we decided to adjust the curriculum and introduce more of a front-end focus with Angular, and then introduce some concepts like Node, and then maintain Python on the back end, mostly with Django and that framework. Dave sent out an email asking for presenters. I think he does it every month, and every month I ignore it. But this particular month, I had made a submission to OpenWest to do a presentation using Angular and then using Django REST, which is a library built on top of Django that makes building applications pretty easy. And I figured I would just adjust it and throw something behind the scenes that was Perl. And so I decided to do Mojolicious. So we'll see how this goes. Ought to be interesting. So tonight we're going to basically just kind of walk through some basic concepts, and then we're going to build a very, very simple application which you can find tutorials for all over. And it's just a simple to-do app using those technologies. So, development patterns. All of you are familiar with Model View Controller, MVC. Okay, Angular and Mojolicious, for that matter, exemplify this pattern quite well. So on the Angular side, we're going to talk a little bit about the model view and controller, and kind of how it works. It's a little bit interesting to kind of wrap your head around initially, but once you get into it and get your hands dirty, it's pretty cool, the things that Angular can provide, at least on the front end. Whenever you can get away from manipulating the DOM directly and somebody can abstract that away for you, your development becomes much more pleasant. Any questions about Model View Controller and that pattern? Okay. So frameworks. The frameworks we're going to talk about, of course, are Angular and Mojolicious, but also Bootstrap. How many of you have actually worked with Bootstrap before? So Bootstrap makes it really easy for guys like me who can't design to put up an application that looks fairly good right out of the gate, right? It hides what we call the boilerplate code. Again, it abstracts that away, and all we have to worry about is reading a couple of tutorials and figuring out where to apply various styles and classes and IDs. Okay, so it's a front-end framework. Its main goal is to provide a responsive design, allowing you to create an application that, of course, can look good on a desktop, in a regular browser, and then also on mobile devices, etc. Angular, it is a JavaScript framework. We talked earlier about its ability to handle single-page applications. Right? You can load up all of your resources at one time, and then Angular can take care of loading things dynamically on demand based on user action or state, however you'd like to design it and architect it. And then, because it follows that MVC pattern more or less, it's extremely testable. And we're not going to talk about testing tonight, but testing is extremely easy with Angular. And you're seeing new frameworks come out that make testing even easier. So I mentioned the Angular conference in Salt Lake in January. We had 700 people there. It was actually far more popular than I think they thought it was going to be. But they talked about a framework called the Protractor Framework, and it's being written by one of the core team members of Angular there at Google. So they're pushing ahead with this framework, which lends a lot of credibility to the applications you're using that have this in there. And then you have Mojolicious, obviously a Perl framework. We're going to be talking about Mojolicious Lite, which is built on top of it, and that just provides an out-of-the-box RESTful capability. Makes it really, really easy to do gets and posts and puts and etc. Feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions. Okay, how many of you have actually done RESTful applications that have RESTful APIs or RESTful services inside? Okay. So again, all of these topics you could do, tons of material on. You could teach entire courses on just these things. But briefly, we're going to be dealing with kind of these 4 basic RESTful API calls. But it stands for representational state transfer. It's essentially using HTTP to handle CRUD operations. Right, so we've gone through this whole cycle of trying to figure out the most efficient way to push data back and forth between a client and a server. I remember back in the early to mid 2000s, and maybe it was before then, we introduced things like XML, right, and SOAP to be able to transfer data back and forth, and turned out to be a nightmare in a lot of cases, right? You started having to deal with contracts and all sorts of craziness just to be able to exchange data. And we figured out, I think as an industry, that this is probably the simplest way to push data back and forth. Not that SOAP isn't useful and that it isn't used, but this is in web development the most popular way to push data back and forth, using JSON and marshalling that back and forth between the client and the server. So CRUD, of course, stands for create, read, update, delete. Comes from, I believe, the database world. And as far as HTTP goes, get maps to read, post maps to create, put to update, and delete to delete. And there's a term on here that we'll talk about just briefly. I actually had to look up how to pronounce this word. I've seen it. So it's idempotent. It's probably various ways you could say it. And essentially what that means is when an HTTP call is made or a RESTful API call is made, nothing changes, or at least you could make the call 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 100 million times, and the state of the data is going to be exactly the same every time. And the only reason that we bring that up is because a lot of people ask about the difference between post and put. When do I use a post? When do I use a put? In the case of a post, you use it when you create a new resource, a previously unknown resource. And a put, you actually update an existing resource. But the important part of that is you pass the entire resource and you update the entire resource, even if you're updating a single field on that resource. That guarantees that it's always going to be the same every single time you make that request.
No side effects.
No side effects, thank you. That's a better way to put it. No side effects.
But if you screw up something, you screwed it up.
You're going to screw it up the same way every time.
Yeah. And the other thing, I think it encourages resources to remain of a manageable size. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Since you have to update the whole thing each time.
Yeah, and I believe because of this paradigm, we have things like Mongo that are becoming extremely popular, Parse, etc. These object stores, these non-relational data stores where the responsibility is shifted back to the developer to make sure they maintain those relationships, which I've got two brothers that are DBAs, and it kind of drives them batty. So it's crazy to think that developers have control over data, every aspect of it, because we know what happens when that's the case. Okay, so basically the application we're going to do today is going to demonstrate all four of these RESTful calls. Okay, so did anybody bring a computer? You're welcome to follow along if you'd like. I put this out at GitHub, so if you go back through the slides, you're welcome to clone this and look at it and play around with it. Again, there are a trillion examples of this very thing, maybe not being backed by Mojolicious, but it's easy to kind of pull and plug things in on the back end. So I'm actually going to clone this repository, if I can remember what it's called. And we're going to kind of walk through this. So I set this up in a way that there's various branches inside of this repository, and so all you have to do is check out the branch that you want, and it will give you the state of the application at that point. And that's kind of how we'll walk through it. So who wants to give a really quick synopsis on the importance of source control when it comes to development?
It's important.
It's the only way to fly.
I've worked with too many developers over the years that didn't think it was an important thing, and felt like it was a bunch of red tape to go through to get code released. Hopefully all of them have seen the light. Okay, so we're going to check out the first version of this application. The branch is called V1, and you'll see that we have two files. One is a README file. Oh. Is that better? One is a README file. This README file doesn't have much in it except for a simple explanation of what's going on in this particular branch. And then we have something called package.json. How many of you have worked with Node or NPM?
Just a little bit.
So this application, the only reason that Node is being used is as a dependency manager, NPM as a dependency manager for Bower. How many people have heard of Bower? So Bower is a front-end package manager, essentially, right? A dependency manager. And so this package.json is a conventional file. When we run something called an npm install, it looks for this and installs all the dependencies that we have sitting there. In this case, we have one dependency, and it's Bower. And notice that we have a script. It's a post-install script, and it finds that Bower executable inside of the Node modules and then executes that file. And so if we run, for example, an npm install here, it will go out, of course, find all of the dependencies it needs for Bower, and then install Bower. And now we have a node underscore modules directory, and inside of that we have our Bower directory. Okay, so now we're going to go to version 2, and inside of version 2 we've shifted our front-end dependency managers into our front-end folder. It's interesting to go look at other people's code and how they structure their applications, because everybody does things just a little bit different, some drastically different. But they do things a little bit differently. When I do, this is going to end up being two separate applications. It'll be a front-end Angular application with a little Node web server running, and then it'll be a back-end Mojolicious server running, so that there's some RESTful API calls between those two servers. And so in this case, I structure it, front-end goes into the front-end folder, back-end goes into the back-end folder, and we'll see that eventually. So right now, the only interesting thing about this particular branch is that we've included a bower.json file, which is very, very similar to the package.json, and it just declares the dependencies that we have. In this case, we've only included the Bootstrap dependency. Another important file, if I can get to it, that goes along with this is something called .bower.rc. And this simply declares where you want those Bower packages to be installed. And so you'll see that eventually, you'll see right now that I have a public folder inside of front end. That's where all the static files essentially go and all the libraries go. And we're going to stick these dependencies for Bootstrap and Angular inside of that directory.
Bootstrap too. Bootstrap also.
Yes, that's right. Those are the only two dependencies we're going to have in this application, is Bootstrap and Angular. Any questions so far? Okay. Another step in being able to bootstrap this application is the actual node server that runs. This is a very, very standard implementation of this web server, something that I pulled out of a seed project along the way. And its sole purpose is to declare the port and then serve up whatever requests come through and give me the appropriate resource. Or throw your typical 400.
I understand, though, this server is going to be running within the browser, right? It's running at the back end.
This will be running essentially like a back end, and that's what Node behaves as, right, is a back end. And so you'll see people will create an Angular app and try and figure out exactly how they're going to have that served up. Am I going to use Node, this little simple Node server? Am I going to use Apache? What am I going to use to serve this up? And when you head out to places like Heroku or Elastic Beanstalk or App Engine, you have to figure out kind of how you're going to do that. And a lot of what people will do is they'll create a little PHP file and just redirect to this index file. And something like Heroku can just pick up that it's a PHP file and automatically spin up Apache for you if you don't want to go the Node route. But yes, it's just a backend server.
Okay.
And then we have our index file, which is very, very, very simplistic. Loads jQuery and loads Bootstrap. So if we want to actually display this, we can go in and we can run that JS file. And it tells us, because I have a little print statement at the bottom, it tells us the address and the port that it's running on. So we can then pull up our simple little application. So nothing magical, right? But kind of progressing through how to bootstrap one of these projects, showing you how simple it is, especially when you start including package managers. The great thing about these package managers, of course, is you don't have to store any of this in source control. You don't have to worry about Heroku having to pull these in and taking up whatever amount of space it does. It just runs the package managers and pulls everything that it needs to. Okay. So now, what am I on? Version 4? Version 4 is now getting us to the point where we see Angular introduced. And so you'll see here that our index file looks a little bit different. you'll see at the top that we have something called, it's an Angular directive, ng-app. And this is what is required for Angular to actually begin its process of looking for other directives that are embedded. This ng-app directive can go on any HTML tag that you want. I'm throwing it up here because I want my entire HTML file to be processed with Angular's engine. Okay, you'll notice here as well that I include Angular's JavaScript library. This is something that will be included when we run our npm install and Bower gets run and loads those dependencies. And then you'll notice at the very bottom that I include a customized script. And this is where we actually declare our Angular module.
So how big are these? I mean, jQuery's, let's say 250,000. How big is Bootstrap and Angular?
How many lines of code?
No, just when it's minimized, how big is it?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Is it 1,000,000 bytes?
I don't know.
I'm just curious how big this is.
I don't know. Does anybody know?
It's a one-time thing now.
It gets loaded one time. That's right, which is important.
I'm sorry. You said that the ng-app directive can be placed on any tag. Does that mean you could have multiple apps in one document?
You can.
Okay.
Yep, and you'll see people, we talk about single-page applications, you'll see people create entire web applications that are just sets of single-page applications, right? They shift from page to page. And so on a particular page, you may have an application or a module that has controllers, and then as you shift to another page, it's a whole separate module with a whole separate set of controllers, etc. Ours is simple enough that we do everything in one. And then we also have an app.css there. What's that?
I was going to say, a lot of that is Twitter directives, Twitter Bootstrap directives. I mean,
everything in here, all these classes are all Bootstrap. Absolutely. Again, as you get into larger applications, you start writing your own CSS. But much of it is handled extremely well by Bootstrap. And so, again, in this case, there's no reason to mess with it. And one thing you'll notice down there also is there's a paragraph tag. And it has an example of how you access things on the scope, things in the model. So in this case, it's double curly brace on both sides. For the most part, this is okay. Where you do run into some issue is specifically with Django and any templating language that uses the same syntax, right? So in Django, you actually have to wrap blocks in a verbatim block, essentially. And then Django basically stops its engine and reads it normally.
you can't reconfigure the delimiter?
You can, but that's not convention.
Oh, okay.
It's how they used to do it.
But it's not convention.
It's not convention. So verbatim was something that somebody built, and then it was, I think it was integrated in 1.4 of Django. And once that was integrated into Django's core libraries, the convention became just create a verbatim block. Right? But yes, there are many recipes out there on how to make that change.
Most of them are a bad idea.
They are now.
Yeah.
They were a great idea when they happened, but there's no reason to now. Okay, so now we can rerun this server, and if we refresh our page, always miss this important step. You actually have to run the package manager to get all the dependencies downloaded. So we're going to run that now. You do this enough times, and you recognize when your application explodes that you forgot a very important step like this. Did you have a question?
I was going to ask, on the Angular line that you put at the bottom of the paragraph, is there a reason you skipped closing the paragraph? I don't do web development at all, really.
No, it's called poor coding on my part.
Okay.
No, this absolutely should be.
Angular did
No,
something like leave it out.
That absolutely should be closed.
Okay.
No, gone are the days of horrible HTML documents. There should be no excuse for writing poor HTML. But yeah, I just missed it. Thank you for bringing that up. So you'll see now that this lib directory exists, and we have Angular Bootstrap jQuery, everything that we need. And if we come back out here and refresh this, if we restart our server and then run it again, you'll see that it cuts it off a bit. But you'll see with some simple, obviously including Bootstrap and some simple styles, you can get a fairly decent looking application. Obviously this is very simplistic. It's the starter template that you can get off of Bootstrap's corporate site or main site. Okay, and this paragraph that I was talking about demonstrates an Angular expression. You'll see right there that we simply just do a string literal and then do a plus sign in between to concatenate those things. So overloaded operator in this case. And that's it. That's how easy it is to bootstrap an Angular project. As a note, this app.js simply declares a new module, gives that module a name, and then stores it in a global variable that can then be accessed later on, as we'll see. These little square brackets that you see that are empty, as you have dependencies in your module, that's where those dependencies would go. We're going to have a single dependency that will eventually end up there. But the enterprise application that I currently work on, there's probably far too many, but there's probably 18 to 20 dependencies that are listed there. Okay, any questions? Okay, so what version am I on? 5. Okay, so in version 5, this is where we show, you'll see I have a conflict. We'll just get rid of it for now. This is where we actually start to list out our to-dos. And so this index file comes up. Again, we have ng-app declared at the top. And then we declare a couple of new directives. One is controller, ng controller. And this directive is actually what binds this view back to our controller. And we'll look at the controller here in a second. We have another directive here called ng hide. And this, if the expression inside of it is truthy, will hide that particular HTML element. Okay, so it handles, again, the DOM manipulation for you.
So that there are currently no, yeah, I see.
Yep. And then we have our ng repeat, which is a directive in Angular to say, I want to do a for loop, essentially.
A for loop or loop forever?
It'll loop. It's smart enough to figure out when it hits the end of the list and stop and break out. Okay, so it will continue to loop until it finds that last element. And it repeats the tag that it's declared on and everything inside of it. And so we will get a bunch of table rows with embedded table data cells. Okay, the important aspect here as well is this to-dos is going to be an element, an object that's tied to our scope, to our model, and that this variable is temporary, gets created, of course, at the start of the for loop, goes away at the end of the for loop, and that is the variable name that we use to access elements inside of that object. Right? So to-do takes on that object, and then we hit the properties using dot notation inside. So you'll see here that we have title, and then we also have a checkbox with completed on it. And then you'll also see here at the bottom that I've included another JavaScript file This is what is going to contain the controllers for this application. Again, this application is so small that we could have embedded everything inside of this index file. And I also could have taken all these controllers and just embedded them right inside of the app.js.
Can we see this? Can we see the controller?
Uh-huh. You'll see in very large applications that people get really sneaky with their structure, and they'll actually break out controllers into their own folders, into separate files, etc. It makes sense in larger applications, of course. Okay, so this declares a new module called Angular Mojo to-do app.controllers. Again, you see the empty square braces. That's where dependencies would be declared, if there were any. And then it declares a controller called to-do controller. Matches the name that I declared in the index file as part of that directive. And then it starts injecting dependencies. So Angular has something called dependency injection. I don't know how dependency injection plays in the Perl world.
Describe it.
Okay, so in Java, we have various frameworks. Spring is a very popular framework, and one of its big things is dependency injection. So basically, it decouples the dependencies. It allows you, in the Java world, you can declare an interface, implement that interface n number of times, and be able to switch out those dependencies on the fly because of dependency injection. It takes care of constructing the objects for you and injecting them into the various classes that you need, where you need that dependency. Angular does the exact same thing. It will take services or factories and construct them for you and then inject them where you want them, well, where you declare the dependency.
It sounds a little bit like useful, but maybe more dynamic.
So in this case, when you declare a controller, the first thing that you inject is the scope. And this is the model portion of the MVC framework or pattern that we were talking about. Okay, this scope, whatever we talk about it in our boot camp, we talk about it as a bucket. Whatever you toss inside of that bucket is accessible both inside the controller and in the view, and any changes that are made between the two get automatically broadcast and updated. And that's called two-way data binding in Angular, and one of its huge features. Okay, so in a regular web application, a request is made, the server renders the file, sends it back, and the browser reads it and displays it. With Angular, and then the data is done. Right? The data doesn't change without some craziness going on with jQuery where you do some DOM manipulation after the fact. With Angular, the two-way data binding happens because Angular processes it on the front end. Okay? So if I have an attribute that's bound to that scope, and say, for example, it's bound to an input on the front end, it's bound to the scope on the back end, if I go in and make changes to that input, the changes are broadcast and you immediately see it. I don't know if, well, I do have some examples of it actually as we move forward. You'll see in this simple application that as we create new to-dos on the back end, the front end actually updates automatically because we make those changes. So here you see that we simply declare a to-dos object. We call them POJOs, plain old JavaScript objects. That's all you have to put on this scope. And then we make a call with $HTTP, which is a built-in Angular service. Basically, it makes it really easy to communicate with a backend RESTful API. In this case, I'm actually making a local call to a local resource, just stubbing in data, essentially. And so you'll see here that I have a todos.json. And it's a simple JSON data that gets loaded.
You have a subsequent version that makes that dynamic.
Correct. Yep. So I teach my students that there's a really, really important way to progress through solving a problem. Specifically, in this case, this web application, and that is you take small bites as you go through, and I stub things all over the place, and then I replace those stubs with real data. and it's really easy to track down problems in that way. So in this case, I set a variable. So the get is called, assuming that it's successful. This is an asynchronous call, so it makes a call out and then continues executing the application. And then once that return comes back, it hits one of these two things, either .success or .error. Assuming it hits .success, that to-dos parameter captures the data that comes back. I set a variable called loaded equal to true, and then I store the to-dos that come back into my to-dos attribute or object. And then if we come back and look at the index file, you'll see that this is where to-dos actually gets used. Okay, so if we run this, let's do an install and make sure that I have all my dependencies, and I do. If we run this again, we'll see that those 4 things that were loaded in that JSON file get pulled out and displayed. Okay, any questions? Okay, too basic for everyone?
No.
Okay. All right. So now let's go on. We're in version 6. Version 6. Trying to remember what differs here. Oh. So $HTTP is Angular's built-in service to interact with RESTful APIs. There's also something called $resource, which is a wrapper around $HTTP. And then there's something called REST-Angular, which is somebody's library that wraps $resource, which wraps $HTTP. It makes it really convenient to make a declaration. Essentially, I can make a declaration that says REST-Angular.all to-dos and store that in a variable. And then I can use that variable anywhere else in that controller, and it will remember the route that I want to hit. And I can do posts, gets, deletes, whatever. And REST-Angular is actually something that we use in our application, the one application that I work on at work. But I was running into some huge problems trying to get this presentation done. And so this version 6 is almost a dummy version. And I actually went back to $HTTP because it worked much more quickly. So we're going to go actually straight to version 7. In this case, it doesn't matter. So we're going to have that missing paragraph closing tag through the rest of these versions. Okay, so now we're going to add the ability to create to-dos. And this is as simple as creating a button, and this button has a directive, ng-click. And ng-click is just like on-click, right? Whenever a person actually clicks this button, it's going to execute the expression that's inside of that. In this case, my expression is a function called add-to-do, and the parameter that it passes is to-do title, which you see up above is the model that I bound to this scope. This add-to-do has to exist somewhere, and it has to exist on the scope in this case. So you'll see right here that I create a variable on the scope that is set equal to a function. And it doesn't do anything. It's simply a reference and doesn't get executed until we tell it to be executed. In this case, it doesn't get executed until the person clicks the button. And then it comes back, creates a form data object, which is a simple JavaScript form data object, appends that title that comes through, and then does an HTTP post in this case. And actually you see that I have a backend folder now, and we're going to see kind of how this ties in with Mojolicious Lite. Okay, so it makes a call to the backend with the form data. You have the .success, the .error. Assuming that it's successful, it passes back the new set of data and stores it on the scope, and you'll see that the form or the table actually gets updated seemingly on the fly, although of course there's things going on with Angular's engine. So on the back end, you will see there is a module that I've called mohoangular.pm. In this case, I have stubbed the data again. In this case, is a kind of a class variable or a global at the top. And I've also created a variable with the number 4 because I want the next ID that's created to be 5. And it was the simplest way to do it. Okay? And you'll see at the very, very top that I simply have to include the Mojolicious Lite package. I did it through CPAN. There's various ways that you can do it. I also am using, is it the Morbo web server? I also installed that through CPAN, and we'll be using that to kind of run this. The data is almost identical. I just added, I believe, IDs this time, and I didn't have those before. And a couple of interesting things going on here. And feel free to chime in, those of you that have used this. Mojolicious provides hooks, which are really, really convenient. They reminded me a lot of what we called AOP in Spring, and that is there are cross-cutting concerns, and you can have things happen based on those cross-cutting concerns. And so in this case, I used a hook called before routes to mitigate some of the issues with one app trying to communicate with another app. In this case, I have to set a header called access control allow origin, and it has to allow my localhost 8000 website to communicate with it. Otherwise, it won't work. It'll explode, right? And so I want this to be included before each route is done. Makes it really, really simple. Like I teach my students, every time I start to write the same code twice, you have to think, because you don't want to write the same code twice.
Also one of the cool things about the mobile server is as you make changes to your, it's not a production server, it's a development server.
That's right.
As you make changes to your application, anytime you resave the application, the server restarts, but it doesn't terminate existing connections.
That's right. So it's really, really nice because you can make changes, and the to-dos that you add in this case don't go away, right? Everything remains the same. You will see here that we have a get. Basically says if the only way that you can access this subroutine acts as a controller. The only way you can access this controller is if you make a GET request to this specific address. In this case, it's going to be localhost :3000/todos. And all this does, you see, is take that global data object that I have, the array, and just passes it directly back in a JSON format. Posting, again, if you try to hit this as a get or a put or a delete or options or anything else that may exist, it won't work. But if we do it as a post, it'll come in, it'll take the to-do title off of the param, which is, again, built into the controller that's behind the scenes here. It makes it very, very convenient to be able to pull those off. Pulls that to-do title off the parameter, creates an ID based on the count +1, sets completed, you can't see it, but sets completed to false or 0, and then it increments the count, and then sends the new data object back with the new to-do. Very, very, very simple. Okay? So, if we run, so I opened up a new tab because I knew I was going to have to run both of these. If I run this, it'll run on port 3000. This is on 8000. We should be able to refresh this. We should see a new input box with the ability to add. And you'll see, just by clicking the add button, because of that two-way binding, the table gets updated. And it's extremely fast. Mostly because our logic is very, very minimal. The back-end work is very, very minimal. And you're not storing anything. That's exactly right. Whenever you can eliminate database hits, you're in a really good shape. That's right.
Hopefully your latency is low.
That's right. We all know there's so many moving parts in a web application. Sometimes it's hard to track down issues. But in this case, it's really, really simple. It happens extremely fast. And you'll see, outside of issues you have with the database, people have concerns all the time about Angular and it's dirty checking, right? That's what's going on behind the scenes. It's doing dirty checking, and when it sees that something has changed, it has to digest those changes, and there are concerns about speed. I haven't noticed any major speed issues with Angular itself in our application, but that doesn't mean that those concerns aren't valid. And certainly everybody has their own use cases where that might be. Okay, any questions about how that worked? We'll run through it really fast again. Here's our index file. We have our button. Our button has a directive on it, ng-click, which evaluates this expression inside, which is a function. It hits this function. It passes that data, in this case, the thing that I put inside of the input box. I create a little JavaScript object out of it. I post to the back end with that JavaScript object. You saw on the back end that I simply pushed it on as another element of that array, and I pass the entire array back, and it captures that entire array with this data parameter, and then I just store that data parameter on that to-dos object, and that's when it sees that the to-dos is dirty, that a change has been made, Angular automatically applies those changes and updates. That's right.
So is the data, as we see it now, it's just stored in the browser somewhere? It's not really stored in the host, or is it in both places?
I'm assuming it's in both places. There's two servers running.
And as soon as one sees one's different, they're just constantly...
So the backend doesn't care at all, right? This Perl module's running. It doesn't care at all. All it simply does is it takes the request, fulfills that request, sends data back. But on the front end, Angular is spinning, and it's doing dirty checking, dirty checking, dirty checking. And as soon as it sees a change, it applies that change and updates.
But then the new source is always the Mojolicious app. The data store essentially is built into your Mojolicious app.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mojolicious doesn't know what's going on the front end, but yes, in this case, because I'm storing things globally and that session is still running, it's just stored there. Yep, exactly. But they're two, even though we have this project set up together, these are two completely independent pieces.
When you say Angular is looking to see if it's dirty, does that mean it's constantly making queries?
It is. It's constantly checking.
And so you have
that overhead.
Heavy data traffic all the time then?
There's overhead there. People brought up this concern at the Angular conference that I was at in January, and they were not overly concerned with the overhead. It's efficient, I think is how they described it.
But would you say it's happening 50 times a second?
I don't know.
5,000 times?
I don't know.
It's a WebSocket. It just maintains an open WebSocket, right?
Similar, yes.
Similar.
I have not cared enough to research that, no, if that's what you're asking.
My question would be, is there any way that you can configure the frequency of the polling?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's a good question. Those are great questions, and I would push you to do research on that. So, at the end of this slide, I give you a bunch of resources that I used as part of this presentation, and one resource that is it's basically a live book. It's called NG Book, and every time a new version of Angular is released, this book is updated, and I have a copy of it, and it's about 600 plus pages, and it's incredible. It's actually really good, really good. So I would recommend looking at that if you're interested in seeing how Angular can be embedded in your applications. And we're doing this in a way where, again, the back end and the front end are separated. You'll see a lot of what happens because applications are already built. When somebody wants to embed Angular in this application and take advantage of dependency injection and two-way data binding, it's typically a part of the application that already exists. So we talked about Django and Django's templating system, very similar to a PHP app in the fact that PHP is its own templating language. you'll see people continue to use that templating language and then just embed little pieces of Angular inside of there. And it's any calls that are made to the backend are typically not RESTful in that case, right? They're just simple calls to the backend to resources that are running in the same on the same server. But this is typically how you would see applications developed that are distributed applications, where you have a mobile app, and then you have some really, really lightweight backend that's handling, again, the marshaling of data back and forth. And so when somebody walks in and says, I want an iOS app, and you ask them, well, do you have a persistence layer set up? Do you care about saving data, et cetera? Typically they don't. And then you turn to a solution like Heroku, you roll something like this on the back end and send it out there. And then you have a front end and a back end talking. It's really easy to distribute at that point. You have one back end layer that has all of your business logic, and you can have an infinite number of front ends that can hit that API. So I don't know if Angular has made its way into the enterprise market yet. If you have watched any part of the Angular conference, everything's out on YouTube, all of their presentations. But they show a graph, and it compares Angular's popularity or usage versus, I think, Ember and Backbone. And you'll see that everything is steady until August of last year. And then in August of last year, Angular does, of course, an exponential through the roof, essentially. And the other two remain very, very flat. And so Angular is being used everywhere. There are a lot of job opportunities now for front-end developers that know Angular. And this is why you're seeing a lot of presentations across the valley on Angular. And the AngularJS group is actually quite popular, and they actually meet the same night as we do. And so all of my students went to the Angular meetup and didn't come here. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so version 8, there's only 2 more. We're going to demonstrate how to update the status. So we'll make use of those checkboxes that are to the left of each of those to-dos. Okay. So in version 8, if we look at the index file and we look at the checkbox, we will now see that there is a new Angular directive called ng change, which is self-explanatory. If somebody clicks the checkbox, it detects that a change has been made and executes the expression that's inside. In this case, the expression is change completed, and we pass to do, which is the object in its totality. In this case, we're going to pull the title, and we're also going to pull what the status should be off of here. Inside of the controller, you'll see that we have declared a new attribute that is a function reference called change completed. We're doing the exact same thing, creating a JavaScript object with the ID, the title, and the status of completed. And we're passing that to, you'll see why the API has changed a little bit, because we did a little tweak on the Mojolicious side, because I was playing around with things and thought it was cool. But it passes back to do. You'll notice that the address is exactly the same as the one above. One is a post, one is a put. And then assuming everything is successful, we get the data that comes back. The data is then stored on the to-dos attribute, and you'll notice on the index file that things get updated automatically. So on the Mojolicious side, yep, so I created a group because I thought it was a nifty way to group the fact that everything that's going to happen with a to-do is going to happen inside of this group structure. And then I used under, and I did nothing with under except a print statement to display that whatever route gets called inside of this group this under subroutine gets called every time. And so it's a good way, again, if there's a cross-cutting concern along all of these controllers, that you can do something that's similar across all of them.
It's very useful for logins. You can put everything under your under that's only accessible to somebody who's logged in, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yep. Good way to handle permissions, what people can access and what they can't. You'll see that the get, okay, so under we've declared as /public, and so that means that that must exist as part of the URI that comes through, as part of the URL that comes through. And so you'll have /public and then /todos will now return the list of to-dos.
What is any? Is that a typo or is that?
It is a typo.
Okay.
Thank you. There is no such thing as any, but there is any.
Trying to figure out if I missed something.
So any allows us to handle any RESTful call, but then we restrict it. In this case, we restrict it to put, post, and options. So if any of these things hit, and it maps to this /todo, we hit this controller. I pull the method out of the request. Again, this is a convenience thing that gets handled with Mojolicious's underlying controller structure. I pull the method off. I check. If it's a post, I do the exact same thing I did before. I know it's a new to-do, and I just push it on to the array. If it's a put, I come through, I grab the ID, the title, and completed off of the request. And then I do a loop through my structure, compare IDs. If my IDs match, I replace wholly, or in totality, all of the attributes that come through in that put request. And then at the very, very bottom, I pass back the new data structure, the new JSON data. You'll see down here that I had to, as part of my before routes call, I had to add a new header called access control allow headers, and I had to allow get, put, post, and options. Without that, it will blow up on you. Okay, so if we run these again, let me make sure that I have everything I need. We should be able to refresh this. We still should be able to add. And in this case, we should be able to check these items. And can't remember if I output anything in the console. I don't. But if we did output to the console, we could see that the data actually does change. Go away, please. Does anybody know how to close this? I cannot.
Something off to the right you can't see.
I can't even get to it. There we go. So if we click this, and we look at our console, we'll see that completed was changed to or completed as 1 on numbers 4 and 5 and on ID number 2. If we uncheck this, it should change that back to 0. Okay, so it just flips that flag essentially. Again, very, very simple, but a good.
Well, it doesn't flip that flag. It sends it to the server and it comes back and it's reflipped. But it's not.
This is what I'm. This is what I meant when I said that. Sorry. Thank you for calling me on that. There is a directive on this checkbox called ng-checked, and it handles the horrible activity that you have to go through to make sure a checkbox is checked when something is true or false. So it looks for a truthy, that the expression is truthy, to do.completed. and it makes sure it maintains that checkbox. That's what I meant when I said that. Angular is doing that. That's correct with that directive. It's actually very nice. Again. Okay. And again, this ng model directive right here is actually what binds that attribute to the scope. Okay, any questions? Okay, lastly, we will talk about deleting. So in the delete, there is now a button that is added, and it's a delete button. Again, this is using Bootstrap to style this and to create the button. But you'll see that there is another directive, an ng-click directive. Same thing. As soon as we click this button, we want to execute or evaluate this expression. This expression I've called remove to-do, and again, I pass the to-do object. Inside of our controller, we have a new attribute, the function reference to remove to-do. It takes the data. In this case, I construct a URL to show off placeholders with Mojolicious. And this is going to be going to public / to-do / whatever the ID is of that to-do object. And once again, sets a couple of things inside of there. If it's successful, in this case, I'm logging the data that comes back so we can see that it's actually been removed from the collection. And then that new data collection that comes back is set on the to-dos attribute of the scope, which then does its dirty check and does the automatic update for us. On the Mojolicious side, I had to add delete to this allow headers. And then I created, again, an any API signature, takes delete and options, and then you'll see right here this :ID. It's using placeholders. Essentially, whatever comes after that / is going to be stored inside of this ID attribute. In this case, it's stash. I read that you can also access it through param, but I'm not 100% certain because I didn't try it. But you can access it through stash. And again, that's Mojolicious, that's controller structure. So I pull the method off, check and see if it's delete. If it is, I pull the ID out of the stash. I create a temporary data structure. I cycle through, check the IDs. Whatever ID doesn't match, it throws it into this temporary structure, thereby skipping the one that it does match. And then it resets, copies that temporary structure into our data structure that we have, and then sends back that new data structure. So if we run this again, and this, and refresh this, we'll see that we now have delete buttons, and we can start removing elements from this table. Fairly nifty, and we should see output here that shows each time an element is removed. But you saw how it was done on the back end. Obviously, in a real application, you're going to use some type of database on the back end to persist this data back and forth. But for this presentation, that was the simplest way to do it. So that's it. A really, really simple way to tie these two things together. I've used Angular now for probably 3 months, and I fall in love with it more and more each day. There's a ton that I don't know, but I'm really excited to get to know it better. I wish that I had the chance to do more Perl development, but I don't. Most of my work is Python, which is a great language in and of itself. But certainly I'm a little rusty with my Perl skills. Any questions? Any final questions? Again, this is available. I'll make the slides available. I'll send them to you. I did the slides, and we actually didn't use them the rest of the way. But I did the slides out here on an online slide presentation software. And then on that slide gives you access to the GitHub repository. Feel free to reference it. Feel free to clone it, fork it, whatever, and mess around with it. Feel free to completely ignore it. But this was fun for me to do, so I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, guys.
So there's an Angular group that meets.